Why trusting God's plan will change your life. There are moments in life when everything seems to fall apart. You pray, you hope, you work, but the doors remain closed. You wonder why. You cry out asking, God, where are you? And in those moments of silence, doubt creeps in. But listen to me. God has a plan for your life, a plan greater than anything you could ever imagine, a plan that is beyond human understanding. Look at Joseph, a young man with dreams of greatness, yet he found himself betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, and sold into slavery. From slavery, he was cast into prison for a crime he did not commit. Years passed. Imagine the confusion, the pain, the loneliness. But what Joseph could not see in that moment was that every betrayal, every hardship, every trial was leading him straight into God's purpose. When the time was right, God lifted him from the prison and placed him in the palace. From being a slave, he became the second most powerful man in Egypt. And when famine struck the land, the very brothers who betrayed him had to bow before him. Joseph looked at them and said, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50:20, that is the power of trusting God's plan. Many of you are struggling right now. You are fighting battles no one knows about. You've been waiting for answers and they haven't come. But I tell you today, do not give up. When God is silent, he is not absent. When he seems slow, he is never late. His timing is perfect. His ways are higher than our ways. He sees the end from the beginning. Abraham was promised a son. He waited year after year, no child. His wife Sarah grew old and doubt began to whisper. They tried to take matters into their own hands and it led to pain. But when all seemed impossible, when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, God fulfilled his promise. Isaac was born. Because when God speaks, his word does not fail. Some of you have lost faith because you can't see what God is doing. But the greatest faith is not in seeing, it's in trusting. Look at the Israelites. They stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in. Death seemed certain, but God was not done. He told Moses, lift up your staff, and when he obeyed, the waters parted. Walls of water rose on either side, and the people walked through on dry ground. They thought it was over, but God was making a way. You may be standing before your own Red Sea right now. You don't see a way out, but God is telling you today, trust me. Lift up your faith, and I will make a way where there is no way. What the enemy meant for evil, God will turn for good. Jesus himself trusted the Father's plan. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he knelt in agony, sweating drops of blood. He could have called down angels to rescue him, but he said, not my will, but yours be done. And through the suffering of the cross came the salvation of the world. So I ask you, do you trust God's plan? Are you willing to let go of fear, to surrender your own understanding, and to walk by faith? If you do, your life will change. Your fear will turn to peace. Your pain will turn to purpose. Your trials will turn into testimonies. God's plan is not always easy, but it is always good. Trust him today. He is leading you even when you don't see it. Keep praying, keep believing, keep walking, and in his perfect time, you will see the hand of God move in ways you never imagined. Life is filled with moments of uncertainty, confusion, and hardship. You pray, you seek answers, but sometimes it feels like heaven is silent. You wonder why things are not going according to your plan, why doors remain shut, why the pain lingers. But listen, God is always at work, even when you cannot see it. His plan is greater than your understanding, and what looks like a setback may be the very thing leading you into His divine purpose. Look at the life of Joseph, a young man with dreams, visions given by God, showing him that one day he would rise to greatness. But instead of stepping straight into his destiny, Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. Imagine the pain, the heartbreak. These were his own flesh and blood, the ones who were supposed to love and protect him. Yet they abandoned him. And it didn't end there. He was taken to Egypt, a foreign land, where he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. Years passed. Day after day, Joseph sat in a prison cell, forgotten by the world. Was this what God had promised? Was this what the dreams were about? Many would have given up, but Joseph did not. He remained faithful. He trusted even when he did not understand. What he could not see was that every moment of suffering was preparing him for something far greater. One day, Pharaoh had a troubling dream, and no one could interpret it. But God had placed Joseph in the right place at the right time. He was called from the prison to the palace, and in a single moment, his life changed. He went from being a forgotten prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. And when famine struck the land, it was Joseph who had the wisdom to save an entire nation. And the very brothers who betrayed him had to come before him for help. Imagine that moment. The same ones who threw him into a pit were now bowing before him, needing the very provision that God had placed in his hands. And instead of revenge, Joseph responded with grace. He looked at them and said, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Genesis 50:20. Think about that. What seemed like betrayal was actually positioning. What seemed like a prison was actually preparation. What seemed like abandonment was actually alignment for God's purpose. You may be going through your own trials right now. You may feel like Joseph, thrown into a pit, abandoned, forgotten. But God has not forgotten you. What looks like a delay is not a denial. What looks like a setback is a setup for something greater. When you trust God, you must be willing to trust His timing. You must be willing to trust that He sees what you cannot see. Joseph never would have chosen the path he walked, but in the end, he saw that God's plan was far greater than anything he could have imagined. Maybe you lost a job, maybe a relationship ended, maybe you have been betrayed, rejected, overlooked. Do not let the enemy convince you that it's over. Do not believe the lie that God has abandoned you. He is working behind the scenes. Every disappointment, every delay, every difficulty, it's all part of something bigger than you can see. If Joseph had not been betrayed, he would never have ended up in Egypt. If he had not been falsely accused, he would never have been in the prison where he was positioned to meet Pharaoh's servants. Every step was leading him to his purpose, and the same is true for you. God is working even now. What the enemy meant for evil, God will turn for good. Trust Him even when you do not understand. One day you will look back and see that every trial was leading you to something greater than you ever imagined. There are moments in life when it feels like God is taking too long. You pray, you wait, and still nothing seems to change. The longer the delay, the louder the doubts. You start wondering if God has forgotten you, if the promise was even real, if your prayers are being heard. But hear this today. God's delays are not His denials. What He has spoken, He will do. What He has promised, He will fulfill. His timing is not our timing, but it is always perfect. Look at Abraham. God gave him a promise, a son, an heir, a legacy that would be greater than the stars in the sky. But year after year passed, and still there was no child. Abraham grew older, and Sarah, his wife, was barren. Everything in the natural world screamed that it was impossible. They tried to believe, but the waiting became heavy. They even attempted to take matters into their own hands, and Ishmael was born through Sarah's servant Hagar. But that was not God's promise. That was human effort trying to force God's plan. And isn't that what we do? We get tired of waiting, so we try to make things happen ourselves. We rush into relationships we were never meant to be in. We force opportunities that were never meant for us. We take shortcuts that lead to more pain. But God does not need our help to fulfill his promises. He needs our trust. Abraham and Sarah had to wait 25 years before Isaac was finally born. Think about that. 25 years of waiting, wondering, hoping. But when the time was right, God did exactly what he said he would do. Sarah, at 90 years old, gave birth to a son. It was impossible by human standards, but with God, nothing is impossible. Some of you are in that waiting season right now. You have been believing for something, but nothing is happening. You see others moving forward, and you wonder why you are still stuck. But just because it hasn't happened yet does not mean it won't happen. God is not bound by time. He is not in a rush. He knows the perfect moment. And when that moment comes, no power in hell can stop what he has planned for your life. Look at Joseph. He had a dream of greatness, but instead of stepping into it immediately, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and imprisoned. Years went by, and nothing seemed to be happening. But when the time was right, in a single day, he went from a prisoner to a ruler. Look at Moses. He was called to deliver Israel, but he spent 40 years in the wilderness before God sent him back to Egypt. The waiting was not wasted time. It was preparation. Look at Jesus. He waited 30 years before he stepped into his ministry. For 3 years he preached, healed, and performed miracles. Yet when he hung on the cross, it looked like all hope was lost. But 3 days later, the greatest promise of all was fulfilled. He rose from the grave. God is never late. He is never early. He is always on time. The delay you are experiencing is not a denial. It is a divine setup for something greater than you can imagine. So do not give up. Do not lose faith. Keep praying. Keep believing, keep trusting. If God could give a child to a 90-year-old woman, if he could raise a man from the dead, if he could turn a slave into a ruler overnight, then he can and will do the impossible in your life. Hold on. Your promise is coming. There are moments in life when you feel trapped, when every direction seems blocked and fear whispers that there is no way out. You look ahead and all you see is an impossible obstacle. You look behind and the past is chasing you down. You feel surrounded, outnumbered, and helpless. But listen to me. Faith is trusting even when you don't see the way. Faith is believing that when there is no path forward, God can make one.